And we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Williams, Program Evaluation Specialist with the Fulton County Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. And welcome to week 2 of our month-long series in recognition of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This series is a collaborative effort with several Fulton County departments that include the District Attorney's Office, the Office of the Solicitor General, the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, and community organizations such as Chris 180, Partnership Against Domestic Violence, Men Stopping Violence, and the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. As part of the platform, Fulton County has developed to bring awareness and impactful discussion around domestic violence issues. This series will feature a panel discussion entitled Survivors Speak Out to spark thought and moving conversation around the issue of domestic violence. I would like to introduce you to the moderator for this discussion, Ms. Simone N. Hilton. Ms. Hilton is a Deputy District Attorney with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office under the leadership of District Attorney Fonnie T. Willis. Ms. Hilton has the Brenda Bayham Domestic Violence Unit. This unit is responsible for the prosecution of intimate partner cases to include battery, aggravated assaults, and homicides. Prior to her position in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, she served as a Senior Assistant District Attorney in the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office in the Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Unit and the Sexual Exploitation and Crimes Against Children Unit. Ms. Hilton has handled cases ranging from drug offenses to homicide cases. She started her prosecution career in 2010 at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. While at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, Ms. Hilton received several awards that included the Major Case Rookie of the Year Award, the Trial Unit Attorney of the Year Award, and was selected as a Rising Star in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office in 2012. Originally born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Ms. Hilton made Georgia her home after graduating law school. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Legal Communications from Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 2004. She received her Juris Doctorate from North Carolina Central University School of Law in 2008. Ms. Hilton serves as the Southeast Regional Director of National Black Prosecutors Association. She is the past president of the Greater Atlanta Black Prosecutors Association. She is the vice president of programs for the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys and secretary of the DeKalb Lawyers Association. Ms. Hilton is an adjunct professor at Emory University School of Law, where she teaches a trial techniques course. She is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and serves her sorority through the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter. Ms. Hilton is also a member of the Cascade United Methodist Church in Southwest Atlanta. It is my pleasure and privilege to turn this over and to introduce you to Ms. Simone N. Hilton.
Thank you so much. And I am going to ask External Affairs, some of the links I think that's being provided is sending them to the BOC meeting. So I don't know if there's any way that that could be resolved while I do our quick introduction so we can start this amazing panel discussion. Again, thank you so much. I am excited to be able to moderate this panel with these three esteemed guests that we have this afternoon. As many of us, or many of you were on the call last week, We spoke very much about DV 101 and just understanding domestic violence. And this week we have the opportunity to speak with three women who have decided to be vulnerable with us and have some conversations about their experience. With domestic violence, just a few statistics. We have 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by an intimate partner. Additionally, we have 65% of all murder-suicides involve an intimate partner, and 96% of the victims of these crimes are female. And what we know is that over the course of 2019 and 2020, right here in Fulton County, we have 27 citizens to domestic violence related homicide. So this is an epidemic that we are dealing with in our own community. And with that, I want to introduce our panelists so we can go ahead and get this conversation started. First, we have Ms. Nikia Lowry. Nikia Lowry is a licensed professional counselor, certified clinical supervisor, and author. She's a trauma specialist who has extensive professional and personal experience with domestic violence. It is because of her experience with domestic violence that she created the book, 12 Ways to Healing, a guided journal to moving beyond toxic and abusive relationships to help individuals start their healing process after leaving abusive relationships. Although the book is for any woman, it is targeted at Black women who remain at the forefront of the highest rate of fatalities with domestic violence. Nikia endured many years in an abusive relationship with the father of her children, and the journey beyond continues to impact her to this day. It is because of this, she remains passionate about helping others heal and finding ways to combat the epidemic of intimate partner violence. April Ross, Esquire, currently serves as the executive director for the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. A graduate of Emory University School of Law and a member of the Georgia Bar since 2011, Ms. Ross has also obtained her MBA and Bachelor of Science in Business degrees from Florida A&M University. She began her professional career in marketing prior to pursuing a law degree. As a law student, Ms. Ross received notable recognition for her advocacy skills, receiving an esteemed Emory Law Kessler Edison Trial Advocacy Award and scholarship. She participated in Emory Law's mock trial team and was the national finalist in her competition division. Ms. Ross furthered her advocacy working as the coordinator of the Barton Juvenile Law Clinic Know Your Rights program, dedicated to educating youth about their rights when encountering law enforcement and the criminal justice system. She was a volunteer legal advocate for the Partnership Against Domestic Violence in the Fulton County Safe Families Office, helping victims of domestic abuse obtain emergency protective orders and find safe alternatives. In 2012, Ms. Ross began working as an assistant district attorney at the Fulton County DA's office. As a young prosecutor, she worked on a variety of cases and was eventually assigned to the investigation and trial team for the Atlanta Public Schools cheating scandal. On April 25th, 2014, Ms. Ross's life was tragically altered when she was shot by her estranged husband after filing for divorce. The attack left her paralyzed from the chest down. Since the shooting, Ms. Ross has been advocating for an improved response to domestic violence in Georgia and helping survivors of abusive relationships rebuild their lives. Ms. Ross works to spread awareness and education about recognizing early signs and safely escaping abusive relationships. She speaks to survivors, youth groups, the law enforcement community, victim advocacy organizations, and the public to foster energy for change against the epidemic of violence in family and intimate relationships. Additionally, Ms. Ross is a peer support mentor for patients seen at the Shepherd Center with recent spinal cord injuries, particularly those whose injury was a result of domestic abuse and or gun violence. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Kyla Janae Lacey. Kyla Janae Lacey is a poet from Shalando, which is Chicago, Orlando, and Atlanta. She has performed at over 200 colleges in 40 states. She has been a finalist in the largest regional poetry slam in the country 4 times. She's a budding cat lady and also blogs for various sites, including the Huffington Post, as well as hosts and MCs multiple events. Her poetry has garnered millions of views on Facebook and YouTube. She's won and been nominated for numerous awards, including but not limited to the APCA's Poet of the Year and Campus Activity Magazine's Best Female Artist. She was featured on Golden Mike TV and a show featuring the hottest spoken word artists from all over the country, and is currently working on her first book. She has facilitated workshops in high school as well as colleges, and would be a perfect addition to festivities for Black History Month, Women's History Month, Domestic Violence Awareness, Women Issues programming, and writing workshops. She has an innate ability to balance heavy issues with her biting humor. She is her parents' favorite daughter, as well as their only daughter, and would be a great addition to your school's programming calendar. So thank you so much, panelists. If you are able to turn your videos on, we would love to see your faces. If not, we understand. But we are ready to dig in. I want to just start with the first question. How did we even get you to this panel? How did you even get here to be a survivor? And I will first start with Nakia, but before we do that, have we been able to resolve the link issue?
Don't do that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So with that, Ms. Lowry, if you can start first.
You tell me what did you just say? I'm sorry.
Sure. How did we get here? How did you get here to this panel? What kind of brought you here to this panel?
Well, I mean, if we want to go back to the relationship that led me to, I don't identify myself as a survivor. That was a point in time of my transition from leaving that relationship. But at this point, I've been thriving for many years. And I coined that phrase to say that, I'm at a point where I'm flourishing. And so I'm no longer just existing. And so that's part of what I do, is really help to pour into women to make sure that they get to that point of just thriving. With that being said, I was in a relationship. I met the father of my children when I was a sophomore in college, Temple University. So Ms. Simone, I heard you're from Philly. And so, after meeting him, I missed a lot of those kind of early signs. We moved very fast. Within like a week of us knowing each other, we were living together. And within a year of us being together, there was a child. What we're going to talk, I know, in just kind of preparing for this, I know we're likely going to talk about the whole power and control dynamic. So I'm not going to get so much into that. But a lot of that kind of power and control, the power and control wheel is called the Duluth model. We're going to talk about a little bit later. A lot of those dynamics played into my relationship. And so, the subtle things were him commenting on my dress and, kind of talking about friends that he didn't like me hanging out with. But the actual physical side of things didn't really start until after my son was born. After that, then it was a lot of comments like his possessions. And so he became very much, very controlling and very volatile. I stayed in that relationship, left. This is another thing, left multiple times, came back to the relationship. He's going to change. He's going to, it's going to be different. All of those kind of nuances that keep the cycle going. I unfortunately fell victim to it many times over. The relationship was about 8 years. I filed PFAs, then wouldn't show up to court. Finally, at some point I had enough, and I finally did, maintain that PFA. I got the maximum in Pennsylvania, because I was living in Pennsylvania still at the time when I left. I was granted the maximum PFA that they could provide in the state of Pennsylvania, based off of, just the last assault was pretty bad. And so 2 children later, I left in 2008. So I've had to deal with the moments of, and that's why I say I'm still kind of dealing with the aftermath so many years later, because domestic violence didn't just affect me. Domestic violence affected my children. I kind of was, moving towards being out of the relationship when I was pregnant with my child. And I just want to make a point of saying this to women, is that I was thinking, well, my daughter didn't see much, she's not affected by it. She wasn't there. She didn't really see him hit me. But what I will say is when you experience trauma, that baby can experience that trauma in utero. And so there was very evident effects of her having experienced kind of my trauma in utero. To this day, she has an anxiety disorder. Where did that come from? It's just things like that we have to be aware of when we stay in these situations, to where there's no way that it's just affecting you as, the immediate victim. I'm going to say it like that.
Thank you for that. And I do have some follow-up, but we're going to wait until Ms. Ross, if you want to go next.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Happy to be here with this esteemed panel, beautiful women. For me, I met my abuser when we were in high school. He pursued me from 9th grade, and it wasn't until the 11th grade that I actually started to date him. But they say you should follow your instinct. And I'll tell you that my instinct the first time I met him was that he was bad news. It wasn't that I could put my finger on it. It just didn't feel like he was right for me. And so it took me a couple of years of sort of avoiding and rejecting. And then eventually he wore on me because he was extremely charming, good looking, very popular at school, sort of the guy all the girls kind of like, ooh, who wouldn't want to be with him, so eventually it's kind of like, I felt like I had the prize. And, our relationship as teenagers became sexual very early. Sex became a central role in the relationship also very early. And it was challenging for me because it got to a point where, the relationship over all of the years was very sexually abusive. Of course, I did not recognize that. It felt, and it was the manipulation as well. It was, the pressure to do things that you're not comfortable with, or using sex as punishment for something you did wrong. But nonetheless, I was very much feeling like this is the person I want to be with. And I stayed in the relationship. And I also did not recognize any signs throughout most of the relationship. I did get to a point that I felt like the relationship was toxic, and I would at least admit that it was probably not the healthiest relationship to be in. My dear sister that just spoke before me, I left and went back many times as well. And it was an internal struggle for me with knowing I didn't really need to be with him, but finding the desire wanting to be with him, and believing that he would change and that things would improve, and eventually he would become this great man. And what if as soon as I leave him, he ends up being this wonderful guy with somebody else, and then I could have just waited a little longer. All the things you tell yourself in your head, and you're wondering if it's the right thing to think. Anyway, we got married after, oh gosh, maybe almost 15 years after dating. It was not immediate. It took us a long time before we got married. But once we got married, again, similar to my sister before, he changed. It was about more of a possession that, I felt his behavior and the way he spoke to me became things that indicated I was more of a possession, and that I was supposed to be obedient and submissive. And he was constantly using that kind of, putting that kind of pressure and emotional stress on me. He eventually would tell me things once we were married, like marriage, the only way out of a marriage is in the grave, and divorce is not an option. But I got to feel like I was suffocating more and more every day. And so I finally made the decision that I was really going to leave. And because I did not know that this was an abusive relationship, I did not know or think that I was in any danger for leaving. I left probably in a way that I would never advise to a woman today. And he stalked me. He had put a tracking device on my vehicle, And eventually, after I filed for divorce and served him with the papers, within a day or two later, he followed me. And while I was sitting in my car, he shot into the window 3 times, and that was it. And he later took his own life that same day.
Again, thank you for again being this vulnerable and sharing. And now Miss Janae. Or Kyla.
Yes, hi, Kyla is my first name, Janae is my middle name. Sorry, so I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what she had mentioned about sex. And then even before that, I think what's really interesting to note is that I remember when I went to initially have some of the charges dropped, which is not necessarily obviously the smartest thing that I've ever done, but it is something that women do often. I think that there's so much, I'm going to turn my camera on, but I am covered in paint. So I just want you to understand I am covered and I'm painting. But I think there's so much that isn't talked about in terms of the socialization of why women get to this point. I think for me, it was, this has to work out. This is my Prince Charming. And I think there were just small little things that I was like, oh, this has to work. This person said they were going to marry me. This person and I have the same initials. Like, you know, how we met was so magical. And so we get wrapped up in that. We get wrapped up in the, this has to be, instead of just saying this doesn't work and I need to move forward. But one of the things I do remember is that when I was the one who was required to take the domestic violence class. And so much of the conversation around domestic violence is centered on the women, which it should be, obviously, but it's never about the prevention. It's never about men seeing the signs in themselves, like what they can do on their behalf to prevent this from happening, or how the socialization even gets to the point where we think that men think that this is acceptable behavior to somebody that they love. And like I was saying with the concept of sex, for me, it took me a very, very long time to have sex that wasn't service oriented, that was about me receiving pleasure, because sometimes, a lot of times the sex that I was having with him was sex to placate him, to make him happy, to keep him from being violent. And I don't think that that's discussed enough. And then what that looks like when you do finally get out of that situation, and how much unpacking is necessary when you realize, like, I'm not having healthy sex practices because I don't know how to have sex where I'm important in the equation. So we met in college. We met our first week of college, you know, and it was the first boy I ever met in college. And, you know, so you know, that was kind of a thing. Even when we weren't together, he said, I'm going to marry you one day. And so for me, there was so much like, oh, I'm, you know, like, this is perfect. But, you know, I think, you know, if somebody also mentioned, you know, him moving on and being better for somebody else, that was definitely a sentiment that I had. But in reality, that's not what happens. You know, it's not you're never the only person that they're going to hit. You're never the only, you know, woman that they're going to strike. And in fact, he had a history of hitting other women, but for some reason to his family, the women were always the ones at fault. So back in 2009 was when he went to jail, and that was really the finality of us being together. And he had been to jail previously, but one of the times I remember he said, I really should have beat your ass. I don't know if I can say that on the panel, but basically inferring that even though he went to jail for being physically violent to me, he felt like he should have really beat me up in order to justify having to go to jail for it. And I just remember even the just delusion and everybody around him being caught up in this lie of knowing that he has a history of hitting women, and still somehow the women are at fault. So the woman who actually ended up with him after me pulled him off of me. And we even, you know, had a short-term friendship. They had been together from, I think they may still be together. And so they've been together on and off for at least 10 years. And I know that she's knocked out one of his teeth. She's cut out or severely cut one of his hands, and they've been back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And, you know, she told me, she said, because it was a situation where he had two girlfriends, but nonetheless, she told me, she said, he was never physically violent to me. And when he saw her see me get hit, that was his okay to do it to her, because she said very, very shortly after he started to do it to her. And, you know, he has a history of this violence, but somehow the people in his life are still justifying that it's the women in his life's fault. Because she told me that even his mom had said, why do you keep going back to him if you're going to send him to jail? Not maybe my son should not, you know, hit you. It's why do you keep going back to him if you're going to send him to jail? And so there's so little concentration on the roots, and so much on the leaves that have fallen. And one of the things I will say too is, you know, people are like, how do you, you know, get in this situation? You never think that this situation is going to happen. You never imagine that the person that you've been with is going to hit you, because most people don't understand is, you know, the violence isn't the next day. The violence is way down the line. You know, it's a slow buildup of unhumaning you. And so it was, you know, it was the verbal abuse at first. It was the emotional abuse. It was the making me feel unworthy. And then it was the physical violence a year into it. And by that time, you're so wrapped up into this situation. And it's not just, you know, there's a lot of confusion too. It's not just somebody you don't know that's hitting you. This is somebody that you do have good times with. This is somebody you do have some sort of connection. You might have children with them. You live with them. So just being like, oh, okay, they hit me, is not as simple as people make it out to be when you have a dependence emotionally, if not just financially, on that person.
And so thank you for that. And I kind of want to circle back to something that you said, that he had a history of doing this to women. Had you known about that history going into the relationship, or is that something that you learned as you all develop, or even after you left?
So the only thing I will say was, you know, it was college. And so it was a girl that was a mutual friend of another girl that he had dated for a very short period of time. And she said he had pushed her up against the wall at the club. And that was the only thing that I'd known. And then afterwards, you know, just finding out from other women, or, you know, he had children while we were together. And he was physically violent to her as well. And then even just after us, there were, you know, even just, you know, me being a nosy person looking up years later, seeing that there was a history of this violence with other women, of him being arrested. But somehow, you know, we were the crazy women, you know, and we were the ones that were making him do these things to us.
Right, and not putting onus on the actor.
Yeah, no,
but
none
the
of
onus
that,
on
none of
everyone
it,
else.
none of it was on him. And when for me, I left twice. I left once for about a year, and then I went back. And he was even more physically violent the second time around. He was much more physically violent the second time around. And the night that the girl that he dated after, he tried to run me off the road with his car, or his mother's car. And I think what was so crazy was because that was the moment that I said, Kyla, if you don't leave, he's going to kill you. He is going to kill you. But no one ever thinks that that's going to happen to them until they're running you off the road, until they're punching you in the face in front of their nieces and nephews. Nobody thinks that that's going to happen to them, because nobody goes into a relationship thinking this person is bad. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. People don't willingly go into bad situations. They don't willingly go into bad relationships. They really have a sincere hope that this person is going to get better. And I think, especially how we socialize young girls to be long suffering, and that's what love is supposed to look like. And it's not supposed to it's going to come with these sacrifices. But a lot of times what we're saying is that means your safety as well. I think the biggest thing for me was I felt like I could love him into being a better person. And that's really what a lot of how young girls are taught, and how women are taught. We're taught so much that we aren't important without a man, or, you know, somebody who wants to change our last names. We're not important until that person happens, that we will sacrifice our dignities and our health in order to have that.
And I think that's kind of been what I've heard the three of you say, like, you thought that you could change. If I stayed long enough, if I loved him a little bit more, then he was going to change. And that just did not happen. So let's talk about, I think the statistics are, it takes about 7 times for someone to leave an abusive relationships. I know, Kyla, you just said you went back twice. Nikki, I know you said you went back a couple of times. How many times did you end up going back before it was that final, like, I'm gone?
I would say at least 4 times, because with me, a lot of, you know, every time there was physical violence, I called the police. So he did do jail time each time. But when he would be released, I was back in the, you know, back with him again. It was that type of a cycle.
Same here.
So,
it was
yeah.
more than twice. It was just, there was a one point that it was a year that we hadn't spoken, but I mean, he would go to jail and come home.
I had a very different experience in the fact that my relationship was not physically abusive. There was not physical violence. I will say, with the exception of my discussion about the sexual abuse. But again, that's sometimes a little harder to recognize as a type of physical violence when you're in it. But I left and went back, gosh, more times than I can probably count, in terms of the breaking up and making up, sometimes very brief, sometimes for longer periods. When he did finally propose, I was actually trying to leave him. You know, I was serious and I was done, and that was going to be it. And, you know, then it was, oh, I'm planning to propose. I've already taken your dad out and asked for your hand. And then it's like Kyla said, you know, you're taught that, you know, your whole mission in life is to obtain a husband. So when you feel like, okay, well, wait a minute, now I'm on that path to getting that, I can't back out now. And when he actually proposed, again, I talk about instinct. My instinct said, oh shit, you know, I don't know about this. And then, but I felt like I was obligated to say yes. I felt like this is what you're supposed to do. And so I went in to the marriage, and it did not take long for me to, it was the honeymoon for a good year of the marriage. And then it did not take long for me to start to feel suffocated and desperate to want to leave.
I want to say something before we move on. And then I'm not saying that April minimized the sexual in any way, but we tend to focus on the violence of physical, and words are very violent. And I mean, I looked up the definition of violence just so I could, you know, there's one of the definitions is a strength of emotion or unpleasant or destructive natural force. The force of psychological and verbal abuse extends far beyond the physical, you know, so when those scars heal, you still have the impact of how that made you feel.
Yeah. And
long after you've left the relationship, you're still dealing with the aftermath of that psychological, emotional, verbal dynamic.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in really quick to that. To her point, yeah, it took me longer to realize and accept, even after I was in the hospital recovering from the shooting, that what I experienced was still abuse because I wasn't hit. And it took people that came when the news people and different folks wanted to interview me and talk to me. Their first question was often something around, was there physical violence? And when I couldn't say there was, I sometimes got interesting looks back because I know what they were thinking. And it sometimes made me question, well, wait a minute, you know, is this really abuse what I experienced? And it took me, that's where my journey really began, to understand abuse and to speak to folks to understand domestic violence looks a lot of different ways. And I think Kyla mentioned that it never starts with the hitting. It starts psychologically and emotionally. and builds up. And then by the time you're in deep, that's when you may experience the physical violence, or you may not. I mean, and technically I did, let me just back it up. I did experience physical violence. It wasn't until he was trying to kill me that he was physically violent, but it does come. The explosion, comes at some point in abuse, especially when they feel like you're losing control over you.
And so I think this is a good segue to kind of talk about, and I'm sure as you all have been just in this space, I'm talking about the power and control wheel and what that looks like, because a lot of this stuff with primarily the emotional abuse, the fiscal, the financial abuse, that is a part of that power and control. And I believe that we're going to put up the power and control wheel for some of our viewers who might not be familiar with it. And let's talk about, I think we've already been talking about it in the discussion about how this power control wheel actually looks and when the abuse is happening. So if we are able to put up the power and control wheel. And until then, something that I thought was interesting until it gets up, have you all watched the show on Netflix, Made?
Yeah.
And I think that is really indicative of really the emotional part of it, right?
Yeah.
Because and I think that people, I'm hoping in watching that movie, while, fictional in nature, some of the stuff, but that is the reality of what abuse looks like. But even how states don't even recognize emotional and financial abuse as abuse, such that they won't do or take the necessary steps unless it's physical.
That was a true story.
It is
Okay.
a true story.
Yeah, that's a true story.
So
It's changed her name.
go ahead.
One thing I will say, though, that we kind of didn't mention, but we sort of mentioned, was we don't talk about the sexual manipulation and how reproductive abuse is a form of domestic violence as well. I was on the pill the majority of the relationship, and I was very poor the majority of the relationship. So the months that we would break up, I would go off the pill, and then he would come back and intentionally try to impregnate me so that we would be together. And reproductive abuse it happens a lot, and nobody ever talks about it, and how dangerous it is, and how it perpetuates domestic violence as well.
Yep. So here, for our viewers who might not be familiar, have never seen what this wheel is. This wheel just talks about how abusers use different things in order to perpetuate violence. And that can be using coercion and threats, using intimidation. I know all the words are pretty small, but being able to use, we've been talking about using sexual violence in order to control the relationship. So let's just talk a little, and you've already been talking about it, how this showed up in your relationships. I know we talked about, but now that the wheel is up, we can talk a little more about how that kind of showed up into your relationships. And I'll kind of switch up. April, you can go first.
Yeah, just going off the wheel, I would say that the things that the tactics that manifested the most prominently in my relationship were certainly emotional abuse. I would go to the minimizing, denying, and blaming, that kind of projecting what he was doing back on me. And it was the mind game. I mean, the term gaslighting is something we use a lot. And, not everyone is familiar with it, but it's where someone, is doing something to you, but at the same time, acting as if it's not occurring, to the point where you start to question your own reality and doubt it. And that was frequently the case. He was, like I said before, extremely charming. And to the outside world, I fed into that, to where we created an image of what we really were in terms of as a couple. But it was very different from what I experienced when we were together alone. And I will say that I fell into something I like to call king-making syndrome, where, I put him on such a pedestal that he was the most important thing to protect. So even when I wanted to tell folks what it was, it felt like I had to protect his image, so much so that, I couldn't really articulate what was happening to me. I would also call out economic abuse. He tried to control my finances and despite the fact that I was the primary earner in the relationship. So I just kind of fell into that, allowing him to be the most important and central thing in my life and in the relationship, despite how unhappy I was with how I really knew, I didn't like what was happening, but I couldn't articulate it, couldn't put my finger on it, and thought things were going to be different at some point.
And Nakia, and kind of know we have to wrap up this session, but if you could just talk very briefly about, what indicators were in your relationship that was a part of power and control.
Sure. I mean, I, of course, dealt with gaslighting. I've dealt with, of course, the emotional side because I have children. So he brought the children into it. He used guilt a lot to try to, that was a lot of his coming back, is him using the guilt of they're not going to be able to see their father, using the fact that I was raised by a single mother. There's that yearning that I wanted to make my relationship work. I didn't want it to be that same cycle. And so he used that a lot. His parents were married, they're still married to this day. So he used those types of things a lot, again, in means to manipulate me. So he used the children a lot. He used coercion. I mean, there was a time where he drove me around in the car and talked about how he was going to kill himself and kill me. So there was a lot of threats. He used the economic, I was typically the breadwinner, but he would do things like come to my job, call me constantly at work. One time this was when he wanted me to do something that I said no to. He's picked the kids up from the daycare one time and brought them to my job. So naturally now I have to leave because he brought the kids to my job. So he would do a lot of things like that. Back to intimidation, he would do a lot of destruction. Like he destroyed our house several times, destroyed my car. I'm all over that wheel, basically.
And then last but certainly not least, Kyla.
The economic abuse was interesting because I worked 2 jobs and he worked my nerves. But he made sure to not work at any capacity that he could. I think what was wild too is I would buy all the groceries. He wouldn't even help with the groceries, stuff like that. It was definitely a lot of emotional abuse. And that's initially where it started. It started with, just kind of breaking my spirit down. There were definitely the coercion and the threats. Or, it was if I wanted to leave, then it was, then that was when the violence would happen. So it was always some cycle of, me, okay, can you leave? And then I'm going to leave. And then, can I come back? And so it was always something, it was always a lot of that. And then, definitely the blaming, blaming, I got blamed for him losing his job. So, it was a lot of all of those things.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, Simona, I also want to throw in, I don't think I touched on it quite, was the male privilege. That happened particularly once we got married, that there was a role that I was supposed to play as a wife. There was a role that he was supposed to play as a husband, and that I was subservient and supposed to be, extremely obedient and do the things. If he said to do it, it was supposed to be done, and there was no question, things like that.
Well, thank you so much, just kind of for sharing and just showing our viewers how this actually interplays in these actual relationships. Like we said before, sometimes when people are looking from the outside in, maybe not in these relationships, they don't even understand, or they're in relationships but don't even understand that they're being abused.
Yeah.
And so that is extremely important. So let's kind of transition now to some of the stuff that you're doing now, some of the work that you're doing now as in this space. So Nakia, for you have written a book. So tell us about your decision to write this book focused on toxic and abusive relationships.
Well, I wanted to help after, women after leaving the abusive relationship. I found that a lot of even counseling, it really focuses on the red flags and those types of things, but it doesn't really speak to kind of some of the things that Kyla was talking about really understanding the dynamics of a healthy relationship. What does that look like? Recognizing nuances like, the effects of trauma. you know, knowing like, for example, like I got so to the point where I did not want nobody's help. I had to do everything myself. I didn't trust nobody. You know, I went through all of these kind of psychological things that I had to heal from. And a lot of it was blind spots for me. I just, you know, got on autopilot, survivor mode. I was just doing what I need to do. I was in that when I was in the relationship. And I found that there's not a lot of tools that really go into the deep-seated psychological things that you kind of have to unpack outside of just being safe. You know, there's being safe physically, but then what do I do next? How do I get to a point where I'm not stuck just being a survivor? How do I move from just existing to where I'm able to flourish and move forward and have healthy relationships and being able to interact with my children and being able to be a support for my children? So I wanted to create something that started them on that journey to get them to kind of process and think. So when I say it's a guided journal, it's really prompts, it's questions. I go through the, you know, the different cycles that we go through. Well, of course, I couldn't cover everything, right? You know, but I try to catch some of the key elements of kind of that time frame after you leave and after you're quote unquote safe physically. What do I do next? You know, so that's what my book is about. So yeah.
And where can your book be found?
Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes and Nobles, Walmart online. It's not in the store, but you can get it online, Walmart online. Yeah.
Okay. And for you, April, what are the important lessons that you've learned through your work in spreading awareness and education that you didn't know before?
Well, like I said, for me, my journey into understanding abuse began at the same time that I was beginning to heal physically from the shooting and starting to realize what I experienced. I spent a lot of time at least early on when I would begin talking about what I experienced. I started to feel like I don't want to just get up and just rehash the events of the most traumatic day of my life. What I'd rather do is have a conversation about how did I get there, and so it sent me down a path of exploring what abuse looks like in different ways. And again, I like to talk a lot about the fact that I was not physically abused, because I don't want any women that are in current relationships where they're feeling that something's not right, because I do believe in intuition. And I do believe that you have that instinct that you're not being treated the way you should be treated. And I think it's important to recognize that abuse does not have to be physical. And so that perhaps people will leave a lot sooner than I did, and break that building up of the maintaining and gaining power and control over you. Because the more dominant somebody is able to exert over you, then when you are finally ready to break, the less willing they're going to be to let that go. And that's when you can get that explosion and it becomes deadly. And so the fewer women that have to experience anything like that, I certainly would like to be a part of that. And so that's what sent me down the path of, focusing on education and awareness. And I, don't say that at all to minimize that if people experience physical violence in relationships. Like she said, the physical violence may not start in the beginning. It may take a year, it may take several months. The point is, if you can recognize some of the non-physical signs early enough, perhaps you can decide this isn't really what you want to go with and walk away a lot sooner. So and that's the part of the conversation I wanted to bring to the table. And I also just wanted to get into some of the advocacy around the way our state addresses domestic violence laws. As I started to learn more about that, I realized that there is more we can do on a policy level to assist women, and well, not just women, to assist any victims that are experiencing abuse. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the path that I decided to take.
And Kyla, what inspired you to pursue your call to be a spoken word poet and to be able to speak about your experiences?
Well, I've been a spoken word artist shortly after I was in a domestic violence relationship, but I was writing poetry long before that. So the two aren't necessarily caused by each other. But I will say this, one of the things I've been able to do is perform poetry about domestic violence and talk about domestic violence all over the country to young college students who may already be in domestic violence. Some of them relationships, some of them are products of parents who were in domestic violence relationships. And I feel like if anybody can hear my and it saves their life, then it's definitely worth it to tell. So.
Well, thank you for that. And so now we have about 10 minutes left, and we're going to open it up to see if anyone has any questions for our panelists. You can place your questions. There's a question and answer box at the bottom if you have any questions for our panelists that we can discuss now. We'll give a few seconds. One was more of a comment. They want to say, thank you all for sharing your stories. It's truly appreciated. What is defined as verbal abuse?
Verbal abuse would be any type of, verbal insults, demeaning, name calling, anything like that, threats, that would be considered verbal abuse.
Degrading, insulting,
Right.
absolutely. All of the things she called out that,
Someone's in the middle. What do you think, and maybe April, you can talk more about this, about where we are with domestic violence in this pandemic? And if you could talk to our panelists about, our viewers, about how has domestic violence increased during the pandemic?
Yeah, beginning last year, early last year, one of the first things that happened, and we all recall it, is the attempt to address the public health issue by asking everyone to lock down at home, and there was also at the same time an economic impact across the nation, which caused a lot of places to lose, caused people to lose jobs, and sent a lot of folks into a spiral. So things that were already happening in the home exacerbated. And so domestic violence became a huge issue. We were immediately aware of increases in severity and frequency of abuse that was occurring. The other thing that was happening, though, was that services were curtailed. So some domestic violence organizations were not able to take in the same number of people that were wanting to get safe housing access, because they were needing to limit space due to COVID. And I think the way that some of the media covered it initially, people may have just assumed that services were not available. And so it took a lot of effort from domestic violence organizations and agencies like mine to work to try to spread the message that services were still available, and that some of the COVID funds that the federal government made available were used for domestic violence agencies to allow to put people in hotels, so that there was not, we tried to minimize the impact on services. But the other thing that happened during COVID early last year was a huge increase and explosion in the purchase of firearms. That I think has also led, in what we're seeing in our fatality review numbers, to increases in the number of domestic violence fatalities. In 2021, this year alone, we have already outpaced the number of homicides and murder-suicides in Georgia that we saw last year. And we're not even through the end of the year. And I personally believe that is all partly impacted by the greater access people have to firearms because of the number of sales.
Yeah, we're seeing, unfortunately, just in our office alone, a higher number of domestic violence homicides this year. And it keeps trending at least every week or every 2 weeks, I'm getting a call that we've got another domestic violence homicide in our community. Are there any other questions? Here's a question. If a victim is truly ready to flee a violent situation with kids and the abuser is their father, how can the victim flee and minimize the trauma to the children?
Well, I mean, the best thing to do is have a thought out plan as much as possible, because the key is to leave safely. And what we do know is that that is the heightened time, that is the most dangerous time, is when you're trying to leave a domestic violence situation. That's where the fatalities tend to happen. So you do want to make sure that you're being as strategic as possible in leaving. I would say definitely make every attempt to, if you do decide to get a protection from abuse order, that you include the children on that order. But I mean, everybody's situation can be different. So you definitely, if you can, also seek legal counsel, legal advice to know exactly how to, and of course, get your kids involved in therapy as much as yourself.
And I think this will be our last question. Did any of you have a parent that spoke to you about, as children, about domestic violence and encourage you to never accept abuse from an individual?
My parents did not talk to me about domestic violence, abusive relationships. They really didn't talk about relationships in general. There was not that kind of open dialogue in my family. It's something we talk about more now, obviously, because it's impacted our family severely since I experienced it. And, my parents didn't do it because their parents didn't do it. My mom told me that it wasn't until she was an adult that she learned about different aunties or uncles that were abused or were this or that. I have a murder-suicide that had occurred in my family when I was a child that no one talked about, and so it wasn't until I was an adult and approached the situation that we started to talk as a family.
And Nikki and Kyla?
Well, I actually saw it in my family. So, I mean, I got to witness my mother with a black eye. They both could be abusive towards each other. I seen my mother throw scalding water on my father. But at the same time, she would then tell me not to put up with, that type of a dynamic. But what we do know also is that we tend to do as we've observed and not as what was told to us. So that do as I say, not as I do is not reality. We tend to, be products of our environment. So as much as she did attempt to kind of have that conversation with me, those dynamics are something that I've seen in other couples in my family. So it's a cycle.
And Kyla, what about you?
I definitely didn't have either of my parents talk to me about domestic violence, but at the end of the day, I lived in domestic violence. It was just directed towards me from my father. And the irony was when my father heard my poem about being physically abused, he called me. And I hadn't seen my ex at that time, like 5-6 years. So it was kind of weird for him to call and to ask for his number because he had, some conversations that he needed to have. But I thought it was really hypocritical for someone who grew up hitting me. So, or I should say I grew up with my father hitting me. And we don't ever talk about that, how, women are supposed to make some sort of transition from not being physically hit by their partners, but it's okay to be hit by their parents. And what that reinforces, it reinforces that it is okay to punish you physically for not doing what that person wants you to do. And that sets a really, really negative tone in the long run.
Well, I want to thank you all very much. We are about to close. If you have a 10-second, what you want to give to this audience before we close out, what is the one thing that you want our viewers to understand just about domestic violence? If you 10 seconds each, maybe 15.
I would say leave safely. He's not going to change, or she's not going to change. Or if allow them to do so absent of you placing yourself in harm's way. How about that?
I would say it's a relationship, not a bank loan, right? Because so many times that we feel like if I keep going, I put all this energy and this money and this time and everything into this relationship, it has to work. It's not going to return the investment that you think it is. And it's not about him finally being nice to the next person. It's about him not being nice to you.
Amen.
I just want to speak to the public and just explain that I think as a society, we need to give more empathy to victims that are experiencing this and stop blaming and accusing and misunderstanding what someone is experiencing. You brought up MAID. I think that's a perfect example of something that will help people understand that the choices are not black and white when someone is trying to leave an abusive relationship, and it's never quite as easy as it seems. So put yourself in someone else's shoes, be empathetic, stop victim blaming. Our society needs to help victims so that people don't feel that it's their fault when they're trying to leave an abusive relationship. It will help people leave easier if we had a more understanding society.
Well, I want to say thank you all so much for this powerful, powerful, powerful conversation. I know that our viewers were able to just understand, hearing from, like Nakia says, I'm not a survivor, I'm on the other side of it, but hearing from our panelists and being vulnerable with us about talking about what happened to them. So I want to say thank you again. We are, I believe, going to put some resources up so that if you are experiencing mental health or you know someone, then there are hotlines for you to reach out to speak with those so that you can get the help or that you can pass this information on to someone else. So please take a screenshot of it and be able to pass that information on. And thank you. And we hope that you join us again next week as we have our third session in our series. And we're going to talk about a little bit about what Ms. Ross talked about a few minutes ago, the DV and the pandemic. So again, thank you all so much and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.